Brandi Carlile was 15 years old when she came out of the closet as being a lesbian. She was 15 years old, and she wasn't just the only person out of the closet in her town. She was the only person out in the neighboring 3 towns in any direction. She was out on a limb, laid very bare and vulnerable. And in that coming out process, she felt a call to go back to the church. Her dad told her not to, because the church is mean. That was his response. But she really felt this urge to go, and maybe it was a mix of a fear, and maybe it was a mix of a need to feel belonging, and maybe it was just like going to summer camp and feeling the emotional swell that comes with summer church camp. But she decided that at 17, she was ready to get baptized. She had prepared all week with the pastor. She felt really good about it. She was anxious about the fact that she might cry. She was anxious as a self-proclaimed control freak about being dunked under the water, but she was ready and excited, and she wanted to walk to the church by herself. When she arrived, everyone was sitting outside. Friends and family had gathered to watch the big day, the big dunk under the water. And she met with the pastor, who was always smiling. He greeted her and the one other kid who was going to be baptized, and they came inside. And first he asked if they had their swimsuits on, and she said yes. And then he asked, do either of you practice witchcraft? And she said she laughed a little too loud at that, and then said no. And then she had this sinking feeling because she knew what was coming next. Because next he asked her, do you practice homosexuality? And he knew he knew who she was. He knew that she was out. He knew the girl she was dating that had just shown up to watch the baptism. And she said, you know, I don't like that word, but you know who I am. And he just said, I know, I'm so sorry. So she left. She ran, and she went home, and she hid herself away in her room there, just wrecked by what had happened, just utterly and totally betrayed and destroyed. In my own beginning, I really liked the in the beginning story. I liked the way that it was painted so simply. It was a story, like all the other storybooks that I'd read, about how the earth was made and how it all came to shape and form. And it was a beautiful thing until it wasn't. Somewhere in there in the growing up process, some of the complexities of that story from Genesis came to light. The blaming part, the whose fault is whose part. And as I became to a point where I was identifying less as a kid and more as a girl, that was one step closer to a woman who we all know, you heard it, she's the one that gets blamed in this story, which is plain as day, isn't it? But that's part of the problem there. We act like this creation story is just plain as day. Well, for one thing, there's not just one creation story. There are 2, and it's not one continuing into the other. It's here's one account of how the earth was created, and here's another account of how the earth was created. We could hear, and we've heard a number of sermons from Holly on these early creation stories. We could do this for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and not be done talking about Genesis. We could have like 27, at least 27 Bible studies on it. I don't know why I felt like there needed to be a specific number there. But there could be a lot of Bible studies, and we wouldn't be done talking about this. There's a lot to say here. And if we come just to this section of the passage, just this little bit about Adam and Eve and taking the fruit from the tree, and then what comes after, I kind of see 2 threads that we might want to give a closer look at. The first thread is this idea that we are created as humans, and there are some rules to that. There is the limit. And in the story, it feels kind of like an arbitrary limit. Don't take the fruit off the tree. But of course, the story is not just about a fruit and a tree. We as humans, we should have limits and boundaries, for better and for worse. For some reason that I couldn't never begin to explain, we're finite. We don't live forever. Our lives have a beginning and they have an end. It's a limitation. It's a boundary. There are limits and boundaries to how we can and should treat one another with respect and with care, rather than with abuse and use. There are limits and boundaries to how we should use this planet. And this part hits at a better time for us. We're at a point in humanity where boundaries are kind of having a day. We know that it's good to have boundaries. Boundaries in our work and boundaries in our person, boundaries between me and boundaries between you, and how we respect and care for each other. So that part, I can get down with the boundaries and limitations. They give us shape. They allow us space to explore ourselves, our relationships, our existence. They give us freedom, really. And then there's the second part, which is that this passage feels like it really addresses the why. Why do we always screw it up? Why? No matter how much we try to make exactly the perfect political system, why can't we just get it right? Why can we not just be kind to the people that we love? Why do I show my worst? Why do I give my angriest, my harshest, my snappiest to the people that I love the most? Why can we look at a person who has laid themselves bare and been authentic about who they are and vulnerably showed up and told them, why can we tell that person, you don't belong? Why are we so screwed up? Genesis, if you read this passage literally, it gives us the easy answer. Because the first ever gal broke the rule and took the fruit, so we're all screwed up. From then on, from birth to the end, that's us. There it is, folks. Easy answer. The why. But even if that's the case, even if we can accept that why, what's the good and what do we do with it? Do we just feel shame? Like, oh, yep, I am a human. I am born with sin. Or what do we do? Just accept that and there's nothing that we can do with why. So let's ask another question. What is the brokenness? Rather than focusing on why we're all so screwed up, what is the thing about us that's really broken? What is at the heart of all this mess up? And in the scripture, it's also made plain that these two people messed up, reached beyond their limitations, and they ran from themselves. They covered themselves up and they hid away. They didn't want to face who they were. They didn't want to face their beloved Creator. They couldn't stand to, they were naked and they were afraid. Why are we so screwed up? I don't know. But I do know how deeply, desperately hard it is to be laid bare and how much that hurts. When Brene Brown gets on a plane and doesn't want to talk to anybody, she's got a line. She sits down in her seat and somebody will ask her, what do you do? Brene Brown answers, I study shame. And that's when the little, like if there's a partition, it goes right up. I first heard about Brene Brown when Holly had preached about her some years ago, before she was like Brene Brown. Now she's everywhere. Originally, it was the book, Daring Greatly. That was the first book I knew of that she wrote. And now it's the podcast and the social media presence and the Netflix special. She is everywhere because, yes, she has studied shame her whole life, but she also talks a lot about courage. There is not a single act of courage that doesn't require vulnerability and risk. And risk is painful and very, very hard. Risk is love. You know, we can't, if you think about it, you can't reach into love without risking, because the people we love might decide they don't love us back. The people we love might die. One way or another, we might lose it all. We can live our whole lives avoiding that risk. We can live our whole lives trying to avoid vulnerability. We can live our whole lives tucking ourselves away. And we can get to the end of our lives and realize that we didn't show up for life. But we don't have to do that. We get a choice here. And the choice is to step into vulnerability, to let ourselves be laid a little bit more bare, to not sew the leaves together to try to cover ourselves up, but to allow people to say, no, I reject you, or to allow for the other, to allow for the alternative. We all want more joy and more love. We want a better world, but we can't be fully loved without being fully seen. I have been reading Brandi Carlile, who I mentioned earlier. She's a great singer. You've heard some of her music at Peace Church. She's also a great songwriter. I've been reading her autobiography recently, and I've just been like, I meant to bring it today to show you all, but I've been dragging it around everywhere. It's got like sweat drips from reading it on the stair stepper at the gym. It's got coffee stains on it. It's a hot mess of a book at this point because it's so beautiful. And there's a lot of themes of risk and fear. A lot of fear and then a lot of risk. In 2009, Brandi Carlile was in a big place of fear. She was sort of a celebrity in Seattle, the town she lived in at that point. She was a celebrity all over, but really a celebrity in Seattle where everybody knew her. And there were also some hate crimes happening in that area against LGBTQ people. And one of those hate crimes was against a couple, Jen and Teresa, who were attacked in their homes in the night, raped, and Teresa was murdered trying to defend Jen. Jen survived this, barely. Her injuries made it look like she shouldn't have survived, and Brandi just couldn't sleep thinking about this incident. It was just like it had seeped into her very core. And she decided, I think I need to reach out to Jen, because she realized both Jen and Teresa had been musicians, and she thought, you know, this Seattle's not that big of a town. I bet they know me. Sure enough, they had actually shook hands at a recent event together, a singer-songwriter event together. And so Brandi reached out to Jen, not really understanding why, but just trusting. And they went to lunch together. And they sat at this table, and Jen told all about Teresa, and they laughed. And there weren't tears, but they laughed and they shared. And then Brandi asked, have you thought about a path to healing? And Jen knew right away, yeah, it's music. Brandi had brought her guitar with her first real guitar that she bought after her record deal, a Taylor, signed by James Taylor himself for Brandi, and she gave it to Jen. And right there, Jen sung a song by the car. And it wouldn't be long before she started a foundation called the Angel Band Project that helped people who had been in situations of abuse and domestic violence and victims of sexual and domestic violence to heal through music. And every time she does a concert, she shows up. She says, here I am. Here's my story, my truth, my hurt, my pain, and just lays it all out there. We can lay ourselves all out there. Before God, yes, and before one another, before this world, and we can be totally petrified. The call isn't not to be afraid. The call is to show up. The call for us is to sacredly show up in our fear, in our truth, to lay ourselves out as exactly who we are, to share our lives, to risk it all for the holy love of one another. May it be so. Amen.